The state in the bedroom. The fact that criminal liability doesn't depend on anyone's demonstrating the occurrence or extent of the harm the defendant has caused makes it easy for the state to try to regulate people's sexual behavior. Controlling other people's sex lives doesn't cost the would-be regulators much, because they can force the public to pay for it through taxation. The impact of the rules is felt by a sufficiently limited number of people, and the cost of enforcing them is minor when compared to the overall tax burden, so it's easy for those who want to impose such rules to do so. People's sexual needs and desires vary quite dramatically. Things that may be harmful to some people may not be for others. And even if a person actually does harm to her or himself by making a foolish choice, it doesn't follow that it's reasonable for anyone else to subject her or him to legal penalties for it. Anyone who wants enough freedom to make mistakes herself should extend the same freedom to others. But for multiple reasons, some people have very rigid ideas about what other people's sex lives should be like. Sometimes these ideas are rooted in religious traditions. Sometimes they depend on philosophical views, and sometimes they reflect visceral emotional responses that may lack independent justification. In any case, they tend to be very deep-seated, and those who hold them really seem to believe that the world will collapse if other people's consensual sexual relationships are allowed to proceed unchecked. One of the strangest ways in which this sort of fear seems to manifest itself is in some people's belief that different-sex marriages will be threatened if same-sex marriages become widely accepted. I've never understood what the threat is supposed to amount to. Are people afraid that more different-sex couples will break up if same-sex marriage is treated as okay? That different-sex marriages won't feel as special if a slightly greater number of people can marry? That their decision to have children in the context of marriage won't mean as much if same-sex couples who can't have children, just like sterile different-sex couples whose right to marry is never questioned, are able to marry? Obviously, the state shouldn't be in the marriage business at all, but if it is, it has no business at all being discriminatory. In any case, whatever the basis for this visceral distaste for other people's practices, which some people seem to nourish, they're able to use the state to enforce their prejudices. Virginia, West Virginia, Florida, Michigan, Mississippi, and North Dakota all treat cohabitation by unmarried people as a criminal offense. Some states impose criminal liability for the possession of sex toys. 2 straight Florida teenagers engaged in consensual sex and shared photos of their encounter with each other. As a result, both were classified as sex offenders. Not so long ago, depending on where the transaction took place, you could go to jail for buying contraceptives in the U.S. Until very recently, a number of U.S. states criminalized same-sex sex. And the U.S. government's military, the same military whose personnel engaged in highly sexualized acts of torture in Iraq, still criminalizes a number of consensual sexual practices. Members of the Senate and the House of Representatives who approve successive versions of the Uniform Code of Military Justice would doubtless encounter serious political difficulties if they imposed criminal penalties on ordinary people for the sexual conduct the UCMJ criminalizes. But by imposing these penalties on military personnel, they can signal their support for purportedly traditional values and bask in their own self-righteousness with minimal political or personal cost. The state invades people's sexual freedom, and the existence of the state, with its capacity to criminalize behavior even if no one regards her or himself as victimized by it, and even if no purported victim is willing or able to demonstrate the occurrence or extent of actual harm, makes the criminalization of consensual sexual relationships possible. The state enforces everyone to bear the cost of satisfying some people's unreasonable desire to regulate the sex lives of others. If you value the opportunity to explore and channel your own sexuality, you have another reason to oppose the state. The state abuses kids. The state is persistently hostile to the freedom of children. You'd never know that if you just listened to the sanctimonious rhetoric of politicians. They're fond of nauseatingly repeating the mantra that, quote, "it's all about the kids," unquote. Think about the frequency with which, quote, "a brighter future for our children," unquote, serves as the rationalization for some new piece of political idiocy. But take a look at what the state actually does. Among the most troubling ways in which it makes this clear is by lending its forcible support to parents interested in keeping children under their control. Children who don't want to live with their parents can be forced to do so. They can be dragged home by the police, deposited in homes they want to escape, and the law is perfectly willing to support parents who use their state-granted authority to insist that children participate in sadistic behavior modification programs designed to make them more pliable, at the cost of their individuality and freedom. It's even willing to back up parents who kidnap children and subject them to deprogramming efforts because they've entered religious communities their parents don't like. Too often, the state treats kids as parents' property. Of course, it's not just support for unreasonable parental authority that often casts the state as an opponent of children's freedom. Think about rules, like the one I mentioned earlier, that treat teenagers as incapable of controlling their own sexuality. Or about local curfew ordinances that deny people access to the state's own spaces at certain times just because of their ages. If the state declined to weigh in against them, kids might at least have more of a chance to develop freely and creatively. If you value their freedom, if you believe they deserve to be respected as the unique individuals they are, say no to the state. The hungry state. The state's assaults on personal freedom never end. It's insatiable. The momentum of the state's development makes it hard to reverse the growth of its power. Once it's claimed the authority to do something, it's unlikely to relinquish that authority. It's harder to overturn an existing law or regulation than to enact a new one. To keep a law or regulation in place, absent a sunset clause, legislators or regulators need only choose to do nothing. So the state's existing array of powers is almost always the starting point for any discussion about what policies should be adopted. The state may expand, but it will hardly ever grow smaller. So the insatiable state claims more and more power. For instance, as I write, the U.S. Congress is continuing to consider the implementation of a national ID card system. The first mandate for such a system, embodied in the so-called Real ID Act, was opposed by a wide array of wisely anti-state groups. In its place, the government is proposing a similar system, now clumsily labeled Pass ID, unpleasantly suggestive of authoritarian regimes' internal passport systems, and featuring many, though not all, of the dubious features of Real ID. For years, the government has encouraged the use of people's Social Security numbers for identification purposes, allowing state officials to track people's movements and financial transactions. During the Bush era, paranoid security freaks and controlling authoritarians joined forces to increase the state's ability to monitor and oversee. Among their most memorable accomplishments was the transformation of the American airport from an outpost of purgatory into, at least, the eighth circle of hell. Heightened security measures slow down transit, subject people to humiliating searches, treat airline passengers as terrorism suspects, and deny friends opportunities to share the tedium and boredom of the pre-boarding process with passengers. The events of 9/11 provided the excuse for national officials to implement plans for security clampdowns that had obviously been in the works for years. Even as U.S. government during the Clinton years attacked nonconformist and anti-government groups like the Branch Davidians at Waco and the family of Randy Weaver at Ruby Ridge, it was also readying the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which foreshadowed the Bush administration's security measures. As long as there's a state, state officials will seek more power. If you care about freedom, reject the state. Whether the issue is free speech, privacy, sex, the drug war, or police violence, the state is the enemy of personal freedom. The state keeps seeking more power. It keeps finding new ways to limit people's opportunities to make decisions about their own lives. It gives Puritans cheap ways to regulate other people's behavior, and it gives its own agents open-ended licenses to use violence against ordinary people. As long as there's a state, personal freedom will be in serious danger.